Okay, so we're starting a new chapter today, gentlemen. And the topic of the chapter, as you can see, is Dine Nizke Mamon, the laws of financial damage. And as we'll see, there are two types of damage in halacha. One is financial damage, and the other one is personal damage. So the first type is where I take your property and I destroy it. And the second kind is where I injure you personally through some kind of bodily harm that I cause you. And while they both fall under the general category of nezek, they are treated differently in halacha. And so that's why there are going to be two chapters. Chapter 8, Siman Ches, is going to be dealing with financial damage, financial injury. And chapter 9, Siman Tes, is going to be dealing with bodily injury or personal injury. Okay, so now there's not much to say, from if we were going to write a work on financial injury, the halacha is fairly straightforward. If I break your window, I drive over your azaleas, or any other kind of damage that I cause you, whether it's intentional or unintentional, I'm obligated to compensate you for those damages. And that'll become clear very quickly. The fine-tuning that the Rav Shulchan Aruch is going to focus on has to do with causing you damage by doing things that may be only verbal in nature, but it actually causes the world to come crashing down on you. And that means, let's say, reporting you to the authorities or causing you other kinds of damage through an indirect act, which may not be directly impacting your property, but through causing a series of events to occur, I end up causing you damage. And that's what the Rav Shulchan Aruch is going to be spending most of his time on discussing in this chapter. And therefore, not surprisingly, this chapter is going to be dealing with the laws of Mesira, of informing on someone to the government, and when this is permitted and when this is not permitted. As we'll see, in most cases, Mesira is not permitted if the objective is to cause this person damage financially. And so we'll see that there are exceptions to that rule. If indeed, let's say, the person is a criminal who is dangerous, then obviously it's going to be mutter and even a mitzvah to report him to the authorities, right? But if the only issue is, causing this person financial harm by reporting him to the authorities, so then that would not be permitted. And I want to caution us all before we embark on this chapter that we're going to see again some surprising things where the prevailing attitude of when this is written, which is in probably the late 18th century, the prevailing attitude is that the government is a dangerous entity and is you have to be very, very careful from it because they are anti-Semitic, and there's a very strong likelihood that they will end up extracting much, much more from the Jew than what the Jew is liable to pay. Okay, so that's an important caveat. But first, we need to just cover the general idea of the Isser of causing someone financial harm. So let's start the chapter. Asur lahazik, it is prohibited to damage mamon chavero, the property of your fellow. Afilu al da'as l'shalem, even if your intention is to pay him immediately for the damage you cause him. Like you go to a guy and say, I really don't like your azaleas. And so you start trampling on them. But you said, don't worry, you pull out your checkbook and you would say, I'm going to pay you for whatever the cost is. That's still an Isser. Kamo sha'asr lignov v'ligzol al menas l'shalem. Just as it's prohibited to steal from someone, even if you're willing to pay them for what you're stealing. There's no difference. Okay. Va'afilu ligrom nezek lechavero. And so now we get into we go into immediately into second gear, and we say even if the damage is causative in nature, bein b'maaseh bein b'dibur asur, whether it is a causative act that is done through physical action, or whether it's a causative act that's done through speech alone, it's asur if that will end. The end result will be causing financial harm to your fellow Jew. And he gives us an illustration. Kagon, Reuven shemocher schora l'nochri. So, for example, Reuven, your fellow Jew, is a merchant, and he has a customer who's a non-Jew. And that non-Jewish customer has been doing business with Reuven for some period of time. And they have a business relationship. Uba Shimon v'amar l'nochri she'ena shaveh kol kach. And Shimon comes along, another Jew, and communicates with that non-Jew and tells him, why are you buying that product from Reuven? You realize he's overcharging you, don't you? So just making that statement. Now, quite often, Shimon may be interested in taking that Gentile as his own customer. Who knows what his objective is? Or maybe he just doesn't want the Gentile to have to overpay for the product. Whatever the reason is. But what Shimon has done is a kind of financial damage to Reuven by calling into question the value of the merchandise that he's selling and suggesting to the customer, the non-Jewish customer, that he's overpaying. Afal pisha ha'emesita. Now, even if what Shimon says actually is true, asur, it is still going to be prohibited. Sheharei onoas nachri muteres. Because from a halachic standpoint, a Jew is allowed to charge a non-Jew whatever the market will bear. In other words, even if the Jew is overcharging the Gentile, just providing that information to the Gentile is causing financial harm to Reuven. Even if your interest is to help the Gentile, you're still not allowed to do it. Okay, we're going to have to obviously look at some of the commentary to this, but that's the standard halacha. You're not allowed to cause financial harm to a fellow Jew, even if you perceive like you're righteously indignant because you feel that he's ripping off a member of your community, right, who happens to be not Jewish. You're still not allowed to go after Reuven. It's none of your business. And let the market bear what the market will bear. Okay. Now, I think that before we go on to the rest of this halacha, I'd like to back up a little bit because we're sort of quickly, very, very rapidly going into Jewish, non-Jewish financial relations. And we sort of have gone well past the basic halacha of causing someone financial harm. So let's back up a little bit. But as you see, this is going to become the whole theme of the chapter, because it's such a prevailing issue of the time when these halachos were being written. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and look at some of the Imrei Yaakov commentary on this before we go any further. Okay. Sorry. Here we go. Asur lahazik. It is prohibited to damage your friend's property. V'yeshbo isur Torah laharbe poskim. And according to many poskim, there's an isur deoraisa of causing someone financial injury. Lahazik, to injure. L'chayiv b'tashlumin afilu lo nehene. And in standard case of where you physically injure someone's property, you have to make compensation, even if you derive no benefit from that damage. Like you're playing a game of baseball and all of a sudden you hit the ball and break the neighbor's window. right? You got no benefit from breaking his window, but you still have to compensate them for that damage. And this is true even if it was done completely by accident. There was no malicious intent to cause him damage, and it was completely and maybe even unavoidable accident. It's still your obligation to compensate someone whose property you have damaged. Vahatam, and the reason for this is, and this is a basic statement in the Gemara, the Adam mu'ad la'olam, because a person, a human being, is considered to be well established as a damager. In other words, this is a distinction that the Gemara draws between human beings and animals. Docile animals, like farm animals, like a cow, is not a type of animal that has a track record of causing injury, because docile animals generally don't injure other people's property. The Gemara talks about that type of animal and it calls it a tam. The word tam means innocent, right? In that it has not demonstrated that it is a malicious animal, right? That goes ahead and damages. And so the Gemara says that in order for an animal to be established as a mu'ad, which means a well-established damaging creature, it has to actually damage 3 times before it has established a pattern that it's going ahead and is wreaking damage. But that and that's the reason why the Gemara says that if an animal damages it the first time, the owner only has to pay half the damages, because there was no reason to assume that this animal posed a danger to other people's property. But when it comes to human beings, Adam is mu'ad la'olam. Human beings are assumed to already be automatically have a propensity for causing damage. It's not like animals that are docile. Human beings have a tendency to go places where they're not supposed to extend of themselves beyond their own person, because since we are free-willed beings, we tend to do whatever is good for us, and we indiscriminately sometimes damage the things that are around us. And as a result, the assumption is that you have to. The assumption is that anything that you damage, you are fully responsible for. You're not like a docile animal that completely by accident damages something. You have you bear full responsibility for anything that you do. Uchesiv ma'kei behima yishalamena. And the Torah says that when you strike an animal, like I injure my friend's animal, I must pay. V'lo chilek hakasuv bein shogeg lemezid. And note how Scripture makes absolutely no distinction in that statement in the motivation or the motive as to why I caused my friend's animal damage. It just says if I strike my friend's animal, I hit my friend's animal with my car, I have to pay for the damage, regardless of whether it was intentional or not. The echad hahoreg behemto shel chavero, o hashover kelav, o korea bigadav. And just quoting the Rambam, it makes no difference whether I kill my friend's animal, or I break his utensils, or I tear his clothing. All of those are examples of where I am obligated to pay for the damage that I cause. Imlo ba'ones gamur az patur. Unless, if it is completely by accident, in which case I can exempt myself. Now, where does that come from? So if you look at the Shar Hatzion, he writes, what's an example of completely by accident? Kegon im haya yashen, v'achar kach heviu hakelim etzlo. The example would be, is if a person falls asleep on a bed where there's only a mattress and a blanket, and there's no property that's on that bed. And then afterwards, a guy comes along and brings very fragile pottery or something made out of glass and puts it right next to me as a prank. Okay. And as I roll over in my sleep, I end up breaking the very fragile property. Okay. So in that kind of situation, um, I am not to be held liable because there was no way for me to prevent the damage. There was no way for me to be held accountable in that kind of scenario. Okay, v'uchagon, afela v'keren zavis the perek hameniach. Another example would be if a person is completely in the dark, or if a person is walking down the street and he comes to a corner and someone else is walking a corner where there's a building, right? So you can't see who's coming around the corner. And all of a sudden you collide with someone and you cause them to drop their package and the package breaks and it causes damage. Let's see, another example. Or another example would be is if your father brings home a cow, doesn't tell you that the cow is a borrowed cow, but he brings home a cow, and the general tradition that you have is whenever dad brings home an animal, you shecht it for the Shabbos meal. So you end up shechting someone else's cow. That's another example. The mishalmin mashenenin aval mashe hizikulo. And in which case, the cow may have been a priceless cow because it was a prize heifer, but you thought it was dinner. And so you do have to pay. You have to pay for the benefit that you received from the cow, but not the cow's value. If anyone remembers that film, what was that film called about the Hasidic family where the guy brings home an esrog that cost a lot of money, and the non-religious members of the household end up using it for salad dressing as lemon juice. What was that name of that film? You know what I'm talking about?
I
So,
can't remember the title either.
but you remember the film, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So the so dad brings home
Ushpizim.
ushpizim, right? Thank you. So dad brings home an esrog together with the other groceries in the house, and you don't realize that it's an esrog for sukkahs that he paid $150 for. You end up using it as a garnish for your fish for Shabbos, right? Okay. Another example would be you enter into someone's property, you trespass onto someone's property, and the owner doesn't know who you are, and he ends up injuring you or injuring your property as a result. The potter balabayis, kidisa b'bavakama. The Gemara says that that's also an example of where the homeowner is exempt from damages because he had no way, thinking that you were potentially a dangerous person. V'cheinim haya bal hachavis rishon u'bal hakora acharon v'amad bal hachavis v'nishbara b'kora depater bal hakora. Another example is if my jug, I'm seated with a jug in my lap, and then the guy comes along with a beam and is holding the beam over his shoulder. And I who am holding the jug didn't see that there's a guy standing over me with the beam, and I stand up. And as a result, my jug crashes and breaks by colliding with the beam. So that would be another example of where the beam owner is to be held blameless because he didn't move the beam. It's the guy with the jug who moved the jug. So there are exceptions to this rule where a person had really no control of the damage that was done. So that in which case you're going to be putter, but only if it was a complete accident. But what if it was only a partial accident, but there's some element of negligence involved? So that's why he says it's got to be ones gamur. So, and that's why the Shar Hatzion says, Aval be'eno gamur chayav. But if it's not a complete ones, if it's not complete accident where I had no control over the circumstances, then I will be liable. So, for example, let's say I'm standing on a rooftop and it's a very windy day. And I normally have no problem standing on a roof doing repairs and normally have very good footing on a rooftop because that's my job. But because it's very windy, it's very gusty, all of a sudden a wind comes along and blows me off my feet and I fall off the roof and I fall down and the shiber esakli, and I end up breaking something that's on the ground. There's some pottery that's on the ground, or the guy's azaleas, and I end up landing in the flower bed and killing his flowers, okay, or breaking his utensil. So that's a scenario where I do bear some level of responsibility, and therefore I'm going to be chayiv. Oh, sheniskal kishehu mehalech, benafal al hakli v'shibero. Or let's say I'm walking down the street, I slip, and I fall on someone's azaleas, or I fall on someone's property, and that property gets damaged as a result. I mean, as you can imagine, you're walking down the road, and your friend has a lawn gnome made out of ceramic. You slip and fall. You fall on his lawn and you break his gnome. Which may be a service to the neighbors, but it's still his property, right? So you have to pay for that situation. V'im Allah b'sulam v'nishmita shaliva mitachtav. Let's say you're climbing up a ladder, and one of the rungs breaks, causing you to fall down the ladder and fall on top of someone else's property and damage it. So then it depends. If the ladder was properly constructed, it was a very solid ladder, and you were wearing the proper gear, so then that's a complete accident and you're putter. Shazu make bidei shamayim. Because again, what we would call that is like in the previous cases where it's totally anus, that you're basically just God's emissary to cause damage, but it's not that you bear any level of responsibility. So essentially, the concept is that there will be a minority of cases where the person causing the financial damage will be exempt because there was no way at all that it was possible for him to avoid the damage. So, hitting my friend's dog with a car, what if the dog runs out into traffic and there was no time for me to stop to apply the brakes? So then it could be that in that situation I'll be putter. But if I was speeding or I would bear some level of responsibility because I should have known that this is a neighborhood where dogs are always running across the street, so then I do bear some responsibility and I have to pay the full amount. In general, I'm either completely liable for the injury or I'm not going to be liable at all. And then we go on to the Imrei Yaakov. He says, "B'davka kishehizik below mitkavein, aval mi shehizik b'mitkavein afilu ones gamur chayav." And the only time that we exclude a person who was totally an ones is when there was no intent involved. But let's say a guy really wants to damage his friend's property and ends up damaging his property by accident, meaning that I have malicious intent, but it wasn't my intention to right now cause him damage. But in that case, even if it was an onus, I'm chayiv. Kamo nirdaf shishiber es hakelim ayin sif beis. We're going to see a case where a guy is, let's say, being pursued by someone who's trying to either kill him or harm him. And in the course of running away from the guy, I try to stop him by putting impediments in his path. So I take someone else's property and I throw it in the road in order to stop the guy. So I'm going to be liable for that damage at the end of the day, even though I was an onus, even though I was completely, what was I supposed to do? I'm trying to save my life here. Guy's coming after me. So I run through the marketplace and I grab a merchant's jug and I throw it down in front of the guy to slow him down, right? But I ended up breaking the jug in the process. So when all of the dust is cleared and go through the aftermath, I will have to pay, for the damage that I caused. It's like one of those, in the movies, one of those scenes of a high-speed chase or when a guy's being pursued by other people and he throws stuff and knocks down the carts in the marketplace and stuff like that. So he's got to pay for all the damage, even though he had a legitimate right to protect himself, but he still has to pay for what he damaged. We'll see that. The Isser has
so that's the Rabbi. That's kind of an instance that's we talked before about. You can't say I'll damage now and I'll pay later, but in this case, under sort of this need, you can say I'll damage now and I'll pay later.
That's right. Right. You're allowed to damage someone's property in order to save your life. That you are allowed to do. Right. So that I do have a right to do that, and I'm considered to be an onus. I have no choice because I have to save my life. But since I'm doing it knowingly, I'm still going to have to pay. Okay. The Isser Hezek Amor Afbemakom Sakana Kidlael Simin Zayin Sifbei Zayin Sham. And what we learned from that, and we've seen this before also in Simin Zayin, is that, let me just see what Simin Zayin Sifbei's, what did we see over there? That was just the previous chapter, but it's going all the way back to Sifbei's. And we learned over there that Vafilu mishuhu b'sakonis maves. If someone's in mortal danger, b'tzorach litol mamon chavero kedei lahatzil nafsho mimaves. Right, and a person has to take his friend's property in order to save himself from certain death. Okay, so he takes lo yitlenu ela aldas l'shalim. So you may have a halachic right to steal your friend's property. This is the laws of theft. You may have a right to steal your friend's property in order to save your life, but you have to have the intent to pay him back. Because as we learned, all other averos in the Torah can be overridden in order to save your life. So therefore, if I have to steal a drug in order to save my life, I can justify doing that, right? Because I need to save my life or save my loved one's life. So that's why we were able to justify stealing in order to save a life. Well, if that's the case, then we can also justify damage in order to save a life. Okay, so that's right. So that's what he means to say. Go back to chapter Zion, because that's what we saw when it came to stealing. Now he says, okay. Actually, we're out of time. So what we'll do is we'll hold it here for today, because this is a new subject which is worth discussing, because it involves a big machlokus between the Rambam and Rashi as to where and under what circumstances you're liable for damages. Is it on your property, the other person's property? Where does the damage take place may impact when I'm liable and when I'm patur. So we'll hold it here. Let me wish you all a great Shabbos, and hope you have a nice weekend. And Amir Tzashem will pick it up Monday at around 7:05. I'll try to be more